Whilst making videos for The Raven's Eye, I've come across many stories where it seems that everything that can go wrong does go wrong, and at the worst possible moment. Today's story is one of those, and involves some very unlucky people who were doing nothing more dangerous than having a camping holiday in the summertime. Now, sometimes you might have an inkling that you are in a potentially dangerous situation, like being in a crowded nightclub that's filled with flammable material and's got only one exit that's a turnstile, or you're working in a hazardous LPG plant that's got leaking pipework. But sitting down to have lunch next to your tent or caravan in an open campground is just not one of those situations. And yet it seems that tragedy can strike anywhere and at any time, as the unfortunate guests of the Los Alfaques campsite were to find out on the 11th of July, 1978. The Los Alfaques campsite is located on the Spanish coast just a few kilometres south of the small town of La Rapita, sandwiched on a narrow strip between the sea and the adjacent N340 coastal road, and on that sunny Tuesday in 1978, it was absolutely packed. Now, the official maximum occupancy of the site was 260 people, but due to a couple of unregistered extensions and being popular with day trippers to the coast, it's estimated that anywhere between 800 to 1,000 people were inside the campground or on the beach by the campsite that day. Countdown to this tragedy began earlier that day 100 kilometres up the coast as 50-year-old truck driver Francisco Villena arrived at the En Petrol refinery outside Tarragona to pick up his cargo. On that day he would be hauling a consignment of the highly flammable gas propane in his tanker. His destination was Puerto Llano, located south of Ciudad Real, some 600 kilometres away. Normally, he would have had a co-driver for a journey of this duration, but for some reason he was travelling alone. And that wasn't the only thing wrong with that situation. The tanker was overfilled, carrying around 24.5 tonnes of propane, which was more than 4 tonnes over the maximum allowed capacity. Also, the tanker had no emergency relief valve installed, something which should have been compulsory for hauling this kind of flammable cargo. Regardless of these obvious hazards, Francisco Villena set off anyway, leaving the refinery at around 11 o'clock in the morning. It was a hot, sunny day, and the propane inside the tank would have already been heating up, expanding and therefore increasing the pressure on the walls of the steel tanker. Now, instead of taking the A7 coastal motorway, Villena opted to follow the narrow, winding N340 which hugged the coastline, passing through many busy little towns along the way. Just a couple of hours later, at around 2:35 p.m, as the truck was passing the crowded Los Alfaques campsite, something happened, something which caused the truck to come to a stop in the middle of the road. Now, accounts vary as to exactly what it was that did happen. Some reports state that the truck suffered a blowout, lost control and hit the campground wall, rupturing the tank in the process. Other accounts say that the loud bang that was heard was in fact the tank rupturing due to too much pressure, and that the driver just pulled over to investigate. Either way, by 2:35 p.m, the tanker had come to a complete halt outside the Los Alfaques campground and was spewing out propane. As the flammable liquid escaped, it became a gas, forming a thick white fog, which quickly blanketed the area around the truck and began spreading out, drifting into the campground and across the road towards nearby houses and buildings. Curious campers looked up from their chairs and their picnic tables, and what was that? Fog? Surely not on a day like this. And then the gas found an ignition source, and Los Alfaques campsite became hell on earth. The ensuing explosion tore the truck in two, flinging the cabin and the ruptured tank hundreds of metres in opposite directions. This massive explosion created a fireball with an estimated diameter of at least 100 metres and temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. The fireball devastated a large part of the campground, the blast wave and searing heat instantly killing anyone in close proximity. Others, burning but alive, ran to the sea to try and put out the flames that covered them, but it was no use, as the sea was literally boiling. Cars and gas bottles exploded, creating secondary fires, trapping injured campers who'd survived the initial blast. The main campsite building had been flattened, killing everyone inside. Caravans melted in the intense heat, and tents were just set ablaze. In the immediate aftermath, it was complete chaos. Injured and dazed campers wandered through a scene of total devastation. Fires raged as survivors stumbled over bodies which littered the ground. Now, people who lived nearby and had witnessed the blast rushed to help, many driving the burn survivors to hospitals in their own cars and vans. The first ambulances arrived at around 3, and the fire brigade finally turned up at around 3:30. They took almost an hour to arrive. The initial explosion had killed 158 people, including the driver, Francisco Villena, but many more were to succumb to their injuries in the following hours and days. The final death toll is officially listed at 217, but 270 fatalities is the accepted higher figure, taking into account those who died later, some suffering months of agony in the burn wards of hospitals before dying. The process of identifying the dead was long and arduous, and it was feared that many of the dead would remain unidentified. The majority of the victims were German, Belgian, French, Dutch and British, and many had checked in unofficially with no ID. However, after weeks of painstaking and traumatic work, only 2 bodies remained unidentified. So the inquiry into the Los Alfaques disaster established the following failings. First, the tanker was overloaded with propane by around 4 tons. In this situation, there was no room for any expansion, and on a hot, sunny day, increased pressure inside the tank was inevitable. Secondly, the tanker wasn't designed to transport flammable gases or liquids. In addition, it had previously carried loads which had corroded and weakened the steel, again lending credence to the theory that the tank had ruptured prior to the truck coming to a halt. Third, overloading of tankers was seemingly common practice at the Petrol refinery. Accurate loading instruments were not available, and as a cost-cutting measure, tankers tended to be overfilled rather than being sent off under the maximum capacity. And fourth, driver Francisco Villena, he did no hazmat driver training. He's not informed of what cargo he was carrying, or nor was he informed of the fact that the tanker was probably overloaded. Now, as to why Villena chose to drive on the windy, narrow and busy N340 instead of the A7 motorway, this was almost certainly a question of saving money by not paying the motorway tolls. Patrol refused to admit that they had any responsibility for the accident, arguing that they held no sway over what route the driver decided to take. Although witnesses later testified to overhearing Villena arguing vehemently with an Patrol manager about money for motorway tolls being withheld. Now, it seems to me that there were failings all round, but what's almost certain is that if Villena had taken the motorway instead of the busy local road, the death toll from this explosion would be drastically reduced. In light of the inquiry's findings, daytime transportation of hazardous cargo through heavily populated areas was prohibited. In the end, 6 Patrol employees were convicted of criminal negligence and sentenced to between 1 and 4 years in prison, although on appeal, all of these sentences were either suspended or reduced. Patrol settled out of court to the families of the victims to the tune of around, in today's money, €62 million. As for the Los Alfaques campsite, it was back in business by Christmas 1978, and it's still there to this day, although now it's called Los Alfaques. The name changes apparently in a bid to distance themselves from the 1978 tragedy, which many would-be guests stumble upon when Googling for the campsite online. Although this is a horrific tragedy in its own right, 270 people were killed and hundreds more injured and scarred for life, it's worth remembering that, in fact, it could have been much worse. If the tanker had have exploded just 3 kilometres earlier, as it was passing through the busy seaside resort of La Rapita, it's possible that the death toll could have been counted in the thousands. That, of course, is no comfort to the men, women and children who perished so horribly that day in July 1978. A hot summer's day, a day like any other in a relaxing summer holiday, but a day that turned into hell on earth for the guests of the Los Alfaques campsite.